Mr. Ambassador, are you following the Iranian elections? Some critics call it selections. What is your take on that?
Well, I think the way the system in Iran is designed, obviously it's subject to manipulation. It has been manipulated over the years. It's not really a free choice among candidates for the presidency. It's carefully arranged by the Ayatollahs to allow only certain people to be able to put their candidacies forward. And in many respects, I think it's a charade for the people of Iran, a charade for governments in the West to present the appearance of a democratic choice when in fact the supreme leader obviously will still hold all the key decisions in his hands no matter what the outcome of the election is.
Ambassador Bolton, there are reports recently in the media that you might be joining the Trump administration. Are these accurate, and what advice would you give President Trump on Iran?
Well, they're not accurate, but you know, there's always a lot of speculation in Washington. I think it's very important that the United States abrogate the nuclear deal. I think it was a strategic mistake for the United States. I don't think the Ayatollahs ever intended to slow down their nuclear and ballistic missile activities. They were able to make small, easily reversible concessions in exchange for huge concessions by the Perm 5 in Germany, the unfreezing of $100 to $150 billion of assets, the lifting of the post-Security Council resolution sanctions, particularly by the European side. This was intended to produce a substantial economic benefit for Iran to lock the Europeans and Americans into commercial deals that would be impossible to reverse. All the while, the covert nuclear program continued. Now, they haven't gotten all the benefits that they wanted, although much has gone over to Tehran. But I think it's important to show political leadership here. This is not a deal. It was not an honest deal. It's not a deal that the regime is following. And it's going to cause enormous harm around the region. We already have, in effect, a nuclear arms race underway. The Saudis are seeking an indigenous nuclear capability. We think Egypt is, Turkey, perhaps others. So that in response to the deal, not only is the Middle East and the broader region not becoming more stable, it's becoming less stable.
There is a draft bill, the Iranian Leadership Asset Transparency Act, that was reintroduced in the House, and that requires the U.S. government to investigate the personal bank accounts of Ayatollah Khamenei, of the current President Rouhani, and the top military person Qasem Soleimani. What are your thoughts on that? Any comments on this particular resolution?
Well, I think it's a good idea because I think the people of Iran actually know very well that a lot of Ayatollahs have gotten rich in the period since the revolution, they and their families. The Rafsanjani family as an example. This is the kind of corruption of the revolution itself that has brought enormous dissatisfaction inside Iran, and I think highlighting the personal benefits that the leaders, today's leaders, have gotten really helps expose that the revolution, whatever people thought of it at the time, has been a complete fraud. And so if you were ever able to have truly free and fair elections inside Iran, which the May 19 elections will not be, people would be able to express their views more clearly, and the Ayatollahs and their puppet candidates would not prevail.
What do you think of this increased escalation between the moderates and hardliners? Some people say it might be just election rhetoric. What do you think of that?
Well, to me, the whole distinction between moderates and hardliners is false. I mean, the only people who are allowed to proceed to the actual vote as candidates are people that the Guardianship Council and the Supreme Leader are prepared to accept. So this is not a free and fair election for the Iranian people to begin with. And I must say, in all my years of watching this regime in operation, there's no distinction between the so-called moderates and the so-called hardliners when it comes to the nuclear weapons program. Some are more overt in what they say about it, others are more circumspect, they're more careful because they know that They're much better advised not to draw the attention of the United States to the work that's continuing on nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles despite the JCPOA. So in that sense, on this fundamental issue of deliverable nuclear weapons, the whole election is not only a charade, it really is camouflage for work that's continuing right through the campaign, will continue right after the election no matter who wins.
Were you surprised that Iran increased its military spending by 145%? And what happened? Iran was supposed to get this dividend from the nuclear deal to use it in the private sector.
Yeah, well, money is fungible. So when the assets were unfrozen, estimates vary whether it was 100 billion or 150 billion or somewhere in between. And even though some of it was pledged to retire existing debts, those debts were retired and other money was freed up. I think the whole argument for the JCPOA that it would not only resolve the Iranian nuclear program, but also change Iran's behavior in broader international affairs has proven to be completely false. I think the regime's attitude is displayed in the contempt that it holds for the United States and other Western nations. It's continued its ballistic missile program in full public view. The nuclear program, I think, continues. I don't think the Ayatollahs ever had the slightest intention of complying with the JCPOA. They may well be doing a lot of work under mountains in North Korea where we are unable to detect it. And so this game has proceeded on the nuclear program, but also in taking hostages, in provocative behavior in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, and in a variety of other steps that indicate there's no change in the regime's behavior at all.
Sir, you mentioned economic benefits. You are on the advisory board of the United Against Nuclear Iran, and that is a group by former officials, and they are also warning European companies not to invest in Iran and talking about the risks that will go to the IRGC that controls a big part of the economy. Now, don't you think that the European companies at this point, if they do business with Iran, they might unwillingly make the IRGC richer?
Yeah, that's one of the consequences of this deal. I don't think people really thought it through. I would say to American companies as well, even if it's technically permissible to make sales to regime-controlled entities, they ought to think about the potential consequences going forward. Congress is considering additional sanctions. I honestly don't think either the Obama administration or the regime in Tehran understood that many American sanctions were sanctions not only against the nuclear activity, but the regime's support for terrorism. Really, since 1979, Iran has been the central bank for international terrorism, Sunni and Shia alike around the world. And that activity is continuing as well. So that I think the prospect of major U.S. economic interaction with the regime is actually quite small.
There are debates by presidential contenders in Iran, and they're allowed on national television, but no one talks about any replacement for the supreme leader. It's forbidden to discuss that. Any contenders you think that might come up as a replacement for the supreme leader, and what are the signs that the West should be looking for?
Well, there's obviously a lot of speculation, including about Ibrahim Raisi, who's one of the candidates for president. I think it's interesting that that this is a way to get him better known among the population in Iran, whether he wins this election or not, so that if the current supreme leader dies or is incapacitated or resigns, his successor will not be a complete unknown. This is part of the manipulation of the people of Iran by the Ayatollah's leadership, that they are able to do these things and have no debate over the most important job in the government of Iran. This is not a democratic system by any stretch of the imagination. It was never intended to be one that was really governed by free and fair elections.
You mentioned the people of Iran. 60% of the population is under 30, so they were born after the Islamic Revolution. How strong do you think the regime is at this point? And do you think this generation is somewhat threatening to the existence of the regime?
I think the regime is actually very unpopular. I think it's quite correct to say that the younger people, 2/3 of the population, they can see on the internet, they know from friends that the rest of the world is out there. They could have a very different kind of life. I think there's a lot of dissatisfaction in economic terms with the regime. We've seen recent riots by coal miners, just the latest in a long series of expressions of discontent because they know the economy is run for the benefit of some of the ayatollahs, the political ayatollahs. It's run for the benefit of the top generals in the Revolutionary Guards. It's not being run for the benefit of the Iranian people. The strength that the regime has is because of the Revolutionary Guards. It's not just a theocracy, it's a fascist theocracy at this point. It rests on military strength. We've seen what happened when the people express their dissatisfaction. The guards or the Basiji or their surrogates use force to suppress dissent. So if the Revolutionary Guards were to split, it's entirely possible that the regime would crumble. I don't think it would take much, but it's obviously if the regime is willing to use military force to suppress the people, it can stay in power as long as it has a monopoly of force.